In this lesson, we're going to cover how to create a brand new assembly file. We're going to give an overview of the assembly options, and we'll also be reviewing the browser and how that appears inside of an assembly. To start an assembly, there are a few different ways of doing that. From my drop-down list of the new, I can come back down here and click on Assembly. And you notice it now says Assembly 1 since it's the first assembly file that I have open. Another method is go ahead and click under the New or File New or Control N. And again, we're going to get the New File dialog box. And the file type that we're looking for here is going to be standard.iam. Again, under the Default tab, the units that these files are based on is coming from the installation of Autodesk Inventor. So if you installed it as a millimeter, this is going to be millimeter, or if it was installed with inch as the default unit, it'll be inch. Of course, you also have your other tabs that are available, so you can go back down and find your IAM file. You will notice that there's a difference here. We have a standard inch.iam and a standard weldment. The weldment is actually going to add a couple other environments for doing weldments, and that'll be covered in a later lesson. So as you can see, we also have the metric and then the professional, and the professional tab will only be here if you have Autodesk Inventor Professional installed. So in this case here, let's open up a brand new or a existing file. I'm going to open up this Assembly Contact 2, and let's take a look at the information that's available here. So when I open up this file, you can see that the browser looks a little bit different. We have the assembly panel. But before we get into any of that, let's take a look at the application options. So again, under the Tools pull down, click on Application Options. And then I'm going to click under the Assembly tab as shown here. And the options up on the default here, so deferring an update as changes are made. Do you want to defer those updates, delete those components as a pattern source? Features are going to be initially adaptive. Now, a lot of these options here will be covered in later lessons, so I'm not going to go in depth here. I just wanted to point out in this case that under this tab that you do have many different options for how these components are going to act inside the assembly, as well as there's some information about how they'll be displayed for the opacity. Do we want to see them or not when they're not active? And do we want to zoom up on them when they're placed in or not? So I just want you to be aware that that information is available here for you. Now, before we look at the browser, let's take a look at what's happening down at the bottom here. You'll see that we have two different numbers in this case. The first number in this case is the total number of occurrences. So in this assembly, I have 5 unique components, or 5 components that are placed in here. And in this case, they're in there twice. So that's why you'll notice that we have the 10. So there's 10 occurrences. In this case, there are 5 open documents. So each document there is going to add to that number. Just to the right here, you'll notice that we have a green bar, and a green bar is very good. So what this is telling us is the amount of memory that Inventor is using. So when it starts getting to yellow, we should start thinking about closing some of the files off, or maybe using a level of detail to remove objects from memory. If it starts to get to red, you need to immediately start to close some files or do a level of detail because you are running out of RAM, and that could cause all kinds of problems. So let's quickly, I'm just going to open up another file here, and I just want to see what happens when we go back and add another file. In this case, you'll see that the numbers are changing. So in this case, it says 3 and 8. So in this file, I have 3 unique components, hence the number 3. And you'll see in this case, it's at the number 8 because we had 5 components from the last assembly, and it's 3 components in this assembly. So as you can see that the number of components are being added from window to window. So if you have 10, 15 windows open, each of those are going to be taking memory. So only keep the files open that you're going to be working with. So now let's take a quick look at our browser here. Let me pull this down. So inside of our browser, we have a drop-down list where it says Model. And then we can go back here and you can create a favorites list if you wanted to. In this case, really don't have any favorites here, so let's switch that back to a representation. And a representation where we can go back and turn the visibility of components on or off. We can switch back to those. And again, representations, that'll be covered in a later lesson. Also, from the Model tab here, let's work our way across. We have a browser filter. And in this case, we can go back and remove objects from the browser. Some of the browser informations with larger assemblies can get very complex, so you can go back and remove those. The next option here, again, is going to be our design views from our drop-down list. In this case, we don't have any besides the master set at this case. But again, we'll cover that in a later lesson. And then we have some other options down here for the model versus the assembly view. And what that's going to do, let me just expand this a little bit. So underneath each of these parts, we have the origin folder that we're familiar with in the part environment. But we also now have assembly constraints, and these assembly constraints are actually going to tell Inventor where these components need to be assembled. So if I change my assembly view back to modeling view, you'll notice underneath this component now, the constraints are no longer there. The constraints have now been all placed under constraints folder. So you can go back and utilize all the constraints or edit them all in one place. And again, if I switch that back to the assembly view, all the constraints will appear underneath that specific component, which makes it really easy to do. We also have a find feature, so if you want to go back and place in a certain component and you need some help finding it, that's what this tool will help you do. So, as I was showing before, inside of our browser, it's going to start back off here up on top. So this is going to be the name of the file that we're currently working on. And each of the components will be listed down here. And we can go back and we can have sub-assemblies in here, and they'll be listed as the hierarchy. We also will refer to that as a parent-child relationship, so you can go back and have nesting as needed.